Record button. Thanks for everyone for joining an out of cycle call for the FHIR infrastructure work group. And based on our regular meeting last week, so 9 days ago, we had some deeper discussion than we had work group call time to get through on the topic of subscriptions and messaging. And so what we've tried to do in time for this week's call was to we went through several iterations, Gino and I did, of this deck that we shared a link to. So we shared the link on Zulip, but if folks have not yet seen that link, I'll paste it in here to the Teams chat as well. We went through a few iterations trying to describe what we saw as like a whole spectrum of options and questions, and sort of went through a fair amount of churn, and then tried to boil it down to sort of from our perspective what we thought were the most important issues to talk through as a group, and to get the conversation moving, we decided to make a couple of opinionated recommendations and see sort of how folks respond on that front. So I'm going to dig into the slide deck for today's call, basically to say these are the 3 questions that we thought were important. And the first one is really, we believe, no longer an open question. It's a solved problem, but we just wanted to include it as a setup for the other 2. So the first question is, when you're sending a subscription notification, what content needs to be included for it to work? What's basically the content model for what goes into those notifications? So we'll talk through what we've got right now. Question 2 is, okay, given that content model, how do you actually convey that content in FHIR? So what does it look like over the wire? What resources and data types are we using to send that content along? And there's been a fair amount of previous discussion on that front, going back to Dev Days in Amsterdam and following up on Zulip. So there's links on this slide as well to some of that conversation. And the current plan of record, which is to say like where we got to in the end of our Zulip discussion, was an answer for that question, but I wouldn't say that we've like reached complete consensus. So I've continued to mark it as an open question, but the current plan of record has been to send this in a bundle, where the first entry in the bundle is some new resource called a subscription status to convey that subscription notification content. And then finally, how does this relate to FHIR messaging? And I also listed this as an open question because we've had a lot of conversation about it, but don't seem to have reached a point where we've got a comfortable set of answers. So before I dive into some more detail on each of these and to a few candidate recommendations, are there questions about the setup? Particularly if I've said something that folks disagree with already, or if I'm missing sort of any major points that folks want to add on to the list.
I think last time, I don't think we reached a conclusion on the first point that was brought up on where this should live in the specification. But I think we can do that after we decided on what we actually want to have in the specification. So this is more important.
I agree with that statement.
Okay, yeah, it's a good point. This doesn't get into sort of how we document it and communicate all this. And I agree, we need to get there. Hopefully we can get to a clear understanding amongst ourselves and then figure out where and how to write that all down. Other thoughts on this front?
I took a quick look at the next question. It says, there are data elements. I cannot see which one. Is that documented somewhere?
Sorry, are you talking about the next slide?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'll take that as permission to move on. And hopefully the combination of what's on the slide and what I can say will answer that question. So for the first question, what is the content of a subscription notification? The claim here is that there's a set of data elements that we need to convey anytime a client or recipient is learning about an event that has occurred that is a trigger event for the subscription. And so today we have identified 6 data elements. I think you'll only actually see 5 of them defined. And the place where they're defined today, which I don't think any of us is really happy about, but at least it's written down somewhere, is in a set of extensions on bundle.meta. So I want to, as much as possible, ignore the how. So ignore the fact that these are written down as currently as extensions on bundle.meta, but actually talk about what data are being captured there. So the notion here is when a subscription notification is sent along, there's important information about how many events there have been on that subscription before, how many events we're notifying the recipient about right now, what is the current status of the subscription as of the time that the notification is sent out, what topic and what subscription were actually involved in triggering that message. And there's one more piece of metadata which is not explicitly captured in this list, which is what sort of notification is this? Is it a heartbeat? Is it a handshake? Or is it a notification that an event has occurred? And so those are, when I say there's sort of 6 pieces of data that we need, those are the 6 that I mean. And then in addition to communicating those 6 pieces of information, we also need the ability to convey a set of resources related to the event. And so the simple example here would be, if I'm telling you about an encounter start event, then I need the ability to convey an encounter. Doesn't mean I'm always going to convey one. Sometimes I might just convey the ID of that encounter resource, and sometimes I might not convey anything at all. And that, of course, comes down to what we call in the subscription, our subscription payload content. So this is up to the recipient to say, I want to get a full resource, or just the IDs, or just an empty notification. Depending on what the server supports and depending on what the client wants, they can specify this. But in the underlying requirements, we need the ability to convey full resources and the ability to convey IDs, and of course, the ability to convey nothing at all. But that's a pretty easy one to check the box on, because conveying nothing doesn't really take any special modeling decisions. So those are what we're describing as the core requirements. And then we also sort of labeled what we are describing right now as a future requirement, which is the ability to convey some more event-related content, a graph of stuff that's related to the event. And so we could imagine in the future, when you get an encounter notification, maybe you'd also like to receive information about the condition that was the trigger for the encounter, or the patient and their insurance provider, or who is the primary care physician. You could imagine a whole graph of stuff. We're not trying to solve that problem right now, but it would be nice if whatever solution we came up with for meeting these core requirements had room to grow in terms of meeting those future requirements. So when I say that question 1 is a solved problem, what I mean is, these are what we think of as the requirements for content. And Baz, let me pause there and see if that answers your question.
Completely.
Great. Before I move on, then, other questions or commentary about what we need to send along in a notification? Okay.
Currently, it says time of the subscription has been sent, and it has the URL. Do you also we might want to include a counter, so you can see whether you missed an event.
So currently, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. Currently, we include this event count, not a time explicitly, but a count, so that clients can detect if they've missed anything. Is that the same thing that you're asking about?
It says it indicates the number of unique events that have triggered notification on this subscription. Okay, then I misread the sentence. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Other questions or thoughts on this? All right, so hopefully that's like the less controversial part of the discussion. Mostly this is designed to bring people up to speed and to be a sanity check. Now I'm going to move on to question 2, which is,
John, sorry.
Oh yeah, Eric, please.
Can you go back 1 second? So when you say content related stuff, graph of stuff, for example, that's not only when you talk about the future requirement, you're not only talking about what goes in the notification, but also how to request that, right?
Not on this slide. So I think there's an open set of design questions about, if you want a particular graph of stuff, how do you ask the server for that graph of stuff? How does the server tell you what graphs you're allowed to ask for? And I'm not trying to address any of that right now. My goal on this slide is to say, when you're receiving notification, let's make sure that we've got slots that we could put extra stuff later on.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and all those things are important questions. They're just not the ones that I want to cover today. All right. Other points on this slide? Okay, I'm sorry, and I'm just checking back on Zulip to make sure that nobody had trouble joining the meeting. It looks like everyone who wanted to has joined. Okay, so question 2, which is, how do we take this content that we just talked about and express it in FHIR? And just to recap some of the possibilities, it's an open list of possibilities, but these are the 3 that we've talked about the most. One thing we said was you could just convey the whole notification in a bundle, and then add all the rest of the metadata that we need in extensions. Of course, FHIR bundles don't allow extensions at the root, so we said, great, we'll stash them away inside of the bundle.meta element because that's someplace we're allowed to have extensions. So currently, that's what it looks like in the draft spec for R5. I don't think any of us really like that, so we've had a lot of discussions about how to do better than defining a bunch of these extensions sort of in an ad hoc way. And there have been two candidates on how to do this better. One was make a new bundle type for subscription notifications and create a resource that captures the subscription status. So then instead of a pile of extensions, we have a subscription status resource that we send along at the beginning of that bundle as the first entry. So .entry sub 0 is the syntax that I use on this slide. It's sort of a JSON path syntax. And so then all that content we've been talking about would be included here in this first entry of the bundle. Or the other possibility we've talked about is to use message header in this way. So send a messaging type bundle and sort of decorate or augment the existing message header resource to include all those content elements, those 6 content elements that we talked about on the last slide. And of course, I should say this explicitly, beyond those metadata elements, those 6 content items we talked about, how do we convey IDs of resources and resource content and meet those feature requirements? Well, all 3 of these approaches use a FHIR bundle, which gives us a list of entries that we could use to get that job done. And so we're just assuming that we'll go ahead and use additional bundle entries to convey the resource IDs or resource content as needed. And that looks exactly the same no matter which of these approaches we take to the rest of the metadata. And I won't go through it on this call. I'll show you a couple of these later in the course of some more detailed discussion. But Gino and I put together a bunch of examples that sort of worked through some of the different possibilities in this list and show what these notifications might look like over the wire in various combinations of these modeling decisions. So does that make sense as a setup in terms of how I framed question number 2?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Any concerns or comments in terms of how the question is framed?
No.
All right. Onward. So we, having looked through discussion and thought about this a bunch, we wanted to make a recommendation for how we answer this question, which is to use a subscription status resource in the first slot of that bundle and create a bundle type for subscription notifications. And there's a few pieces of the rationale here. One is this subscription status stuff is all low maturity. Once we define it, it'll be at maturity 0. It's literally not even in the spec yet, so it's sort of not even at maturity level 0 yet. And at the same time, there's a message header resource with a maturity level of 4 today that's being used in message scenarios. And we want the ability to iterate on these things independently so that they can evolve without us trying to yoke a very low maturity, rapidly evolving thing to something that has a fair amount of stability around it. That was one consideration. Another one is that these notifications, we haven't talked about it on today's call, but the idea is we want one way of sending the body of a notification over a bunch of different channels, whether it's through email, where that body might be a file attachment, whether it's a WebSocket, where that body might be conveyed through one specific message in the WebSocket channel, whether it's over REST, where that body might be conveyed in an HTTP request body, and so on. The goal would be, no matter what channel we're using, these notifications could be sent in a consistent way through that channel. The idea then is that there's sort of a message and an envelope. The channel has all to do with the envelope, and this content model here has all to do with the message. And one thing to note when we're thinking about what's in the message header resource is that the message header models out things like event codes and sources using a set of properties where the idea is like these things are very loosely coupled, and the source system has some way of identifying itself to the target system. But in the subscriptions use case, these things are already known by the recipient just based on the subscription ID. So if I'm receiving a subscription notification, as a consumer-facing client or any other kind of an endpoint, no matter how I get this thing, if you tell me what the subscription ID is, well, now I know what the topic is, which tells me something about the event. And I know who sent it because the subscription ID embeds that information I need to know. So a lot of these details are already modeled in our subscription content. And so when we look at what it would mean to do this with a message header, there would be sort of either a duplication of that information, or representing it in more than one spot. And then this is purely, a personal perspective. And I think other people could bring a different and opposite personal perspective. But for me, part of the rationale is what I consider to be keeping the payload simple in addition to consistent. So keeping it focused on the set of properties that we know we need for this subscription notification use case, and not trying to overgeneralize it by sort of aligning it and squishing it to fit with an existing message header. So let me pause there and then try to solicit reactions to this recommendation and to the rationale.
So this is Michael. The very last thing you said, I agree strongly with. I think making it clear that this is different from a message, it's going to have different needs and shouldn't be crammed in together, will have two benefits. One of them is flexibility and nimbleness for meeting our needs for these notifications. And the other is communicating clearly to everybody what this is for and what isn't. How married are you to the name subscription status?
It won in a poll on Zulip. That's exactly how married we are. It was I don't know, 10 people participated, and that one had more votes than anything else.
Gotcha. What were the other contenders?
Here, I'll pull up the poll and put the link in here.
Subscription info was one of them. Subscription header was another.
Where I'm going with this is this conceptual entity, the notification that we send for a subscription, is it doesn't inherently require a subscription. A subscription is something that can trigger a notification, but anything that does publication in any sort of pub-sub model could send something like this.
If you take that approach, then what would be the difference between a subscription notification, a notification, and a message?
A fine question, and one we could spend a lot of time talking about. I don't want to risk hijacking Josh's call if he's got other stuff he wants to get to.
Well, no, I think that's actually at the core of it. And so one thing I would say, Michael, is I agree with you that almost anything that does pub-sub could send something like this, even if nobody had ever explicitly subscribed, except for a couple of these metadata details. Right? If I'm sending this to you and you never really asked for it, I don't have a subscription status or a subscription URL to share with me because you never established those things as a client. Maybe the other details I could try to send along, but the paradigm is a little different if you're getting these things in an unsolicited way. The set of metadata you would want and the things that you would expect a client to understand aren't quite identical. I could tell a story about how there's actually these implicit subscriptions that already exist, and the server would sort of create one on behalf of you before it sent you a notification, and maybe there's a way to sort of square that circle. The goal here has been to solve the use case of notifications that a client asked for to do with a topic.
Gotcha.
Independently where we go. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I agree that this is this is really to the core of the discussion of this call. If we look historically of use of messaging in HL7 version 2, they serve a dual purpose. Some messages like ADT messages are mostly used as notifications. This is what happened. I don't care what you do with it. I don't even know who gets it. but I'm just telling the world this is what happens. It's a generic publication that is not tied to a subscription or to an implicit subscription that is managed externally, has no link to the publisher. Then there is the workflow management type of messages, which are orders and observations, has developed to a very large extent, lab orders, medication orders. And then there is a third group of HOSA messages that make the distinction. Scheduling messages can be, there are separate messages for notifications, for scheduled notifications, and there's separate messages for scheduling requests to be able to act upon request and action based on those messages. So messages historically have covered both. When we talk about FHIR, we have developed something, or the FHIR community has developed something that promises, at least, and to a large extent provides a highly scalable set of resources and APIs to manage those resources. If we properly abstract the notification part, we can get to a good place where the scalability and the underlying architecture, for lack of a better way, of using FHIR resources works well with notifications versus situations where you have this one piece that works a certain way, and for other reasons you disassociate yourself from that and use another type of interaction between participants. So that is my starting point of trying to find solutions.
So thank you for that, Vasile. Let me see if I can summarize it to make sure that I've got your perspective on this one right, which is, I'll just use the term solicited and unsolicited to refer to these two categories. And historically, those have just been two flavors of messages. And in FHIR, they could also just be two flavors of messages, and that's how the FHIR messaging framework is defined today. And if we try to model these solicited notifications, basically subscription-based notifications, in a different way, that would be basically fragmenting these use cases, coming up with a different approach, even though the sort of underlying infrastructure could be more unified. Is that fair?
No.
No, okay, I missed it then.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's why I want to try to restate it.
Yes. The way I see it is, historically, we used messaging for notifications because that's all we had. Now we have the option the opportunity to define notification clearly and use a single way of doing notification. And to use messaging for notification would be an exceptional, extraordinary set of circumstances that would allow that.
So if I understand right, what you're suggesting is that in FHIR, the way that we handle solicited notifications and the way that we handle unsolicited notifications, both of those use cases might actually be better served by something other than messaging bundles with message headers. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, that's interesting. Let me pause and open up the conversation now that I've captured at least the crux there. Well, let me restate it more controversially and see if that stimulates discussion. So one way I could paraphrase what Vasile just said is like, even though we've got message header already and it seems to solve the problem, at least of unsolicited notifications, that doesn't mean it's the right tool. And actually, we probably should be introducing a new set of tools across the board, and that subscriptions, whether they're explicitly done the way we've been talking about, or even whether they're implicitly done the way that Michael mentioned, actually the subscriptions infrastructure is where we should be focused. And messaging can be there and it can be defined, but it's not necessarily something that we expect to be the right tool for either use case.
I will soften it a bit as the right tool, as in always the right tool or the right tool for most cases. There are cases where messaging can be the right tool, but not the only tool, and not the most common application for notifications.
Basil, I might be understanding you wrongly, but aren't we now mixing communication channel with actually what we want to communicate?
That's a good question. I believe we are not, because all we are talking about is the action of publishing information.
So, but is a message bundle in FHIR, is that a summary of data you want to communicate, or is that actually part of a communication channel?
And that is where I think is the core of the discussion, because if you think that messaging serves both notification and other multi-step type of interactions, for example, Graham noted at one point that he thinks messages are just operations. But if you have operation, you have an expected behavior on the other side. And notifications don't have expected behavior on the other side. So that is the distinction.
So I want to keep this discussion going because I think it is central, but I also want to take Boz's last question and use it as an excuse to move on to one more slide, which gets at this.
Josh,
yeah.
Before we go there,
yes.
If we decide later on that messaging is a channel as well, then it needs to be added to the list emails, WS, REST, ...
It is already a channel. And
yeah, I was literally just negligent in not fitting it there. So it should have been there. I didn't want to presuppose an answer, but let me add that just to avoid confusion on that point right now.
Today it's there in the spec. It's just not very well defined. And
yeah,
so
we don't see much about it.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not that familiar with subscription.
No, you're fine.
All right, so let me move on to one more recommendation on the third question, just because I think it will tie into the discussion we've had on the second question as well. So this is how does all this stuff about sending a subscription notification relate to FHIR messaging, if at all? And we talked through a lot of options here, including basically trying to morph a FHIR subscription notification to make it an example of messaging. And we can show you a little bit what that looks like. We didn't love it from the perspective of clarity. So the recommendation that we came up with was to say messaging is a channel, and I've written here, just another channel for subscription notifications alongside the other channels like REST hooks or WebSockets or email. Messaging is one more way you can convey a subscription notification. But when we talk about conveying a subscription notification, whether it's over a REST hook or a WebSocket or over messaging, in all these cases, the content model is the same, and the way that we convey that content should be the same. And so what's the implication there? What does a notification bundle actually look like if we send it through messaging? Well, it actually might look like a wrapped notification payload. So let me show you what that means. And I'm going to apologize in advance for committing the cardinal sin of putting a bundle in a bundle. But this is what wrapping really means. So if I was sending you a FHIR messaging notification, so we're talking about sending something over a messaging channel. Well, what does that mean? It means that I've got a bundle of type message, and it means the first entry of that bundle is a message header, right? That's what it means to be sending something over a messaging channel. Okay, and then every messaging header needs to have an event coding. What event is being sent in this message. And so here we propose something generic like a subscription notification. So under the hood, maybe this was a subscription topic about encounters, and it's an encounter start event that caused me to send the notification. But at the level of this wrapper, at the level of the messaging wrapper, what we're saying is this is a subscription notification type messaging header. And what's the focus of that? Well, it's exactly the payload content we've been talking about. It's a bundle that conveys the actual information. So if I scroll down to the next entry, well, there is my notification bundle, which would have things like a subscription status entry, or to Michael's point, whatever we call it, that conveys the metadata about number of events and which topic and the status and all that. And then it might also convey information about the encounter itself. So that's a bundle inside a bundle. But the recommendation that we're making is that this is actually the sort of semantically right way to talk about sending a notification, a subscription notification, inside of the messaging channel. And I apologize for those of you who are getting my video and my audio at different rates. I was trying to scroll while I paused. So that's what we're making as a recommendation here, that there's absolutely a story for folks who have an investment in FHIR messaging and want to convey subscription notifications, but it's a story that provides a clear separation between envelope and payload, and that the payload is just the same, whether we're sticking it in a messaging notification or an email or a WebSocket or anything else. It has the slightly distasteful consequence of, hey, there's a bundle inside my bundle. But the recommendation is this is actually describing what's happening the best we know how. So I'll pause there.
Why is it actually required? Why can't you just put the entries of the second bundle inside the first one? So it is, we've got examples written up sort of each way to sort of see what this would look like. If you start putting the entries of it, so you absolutely could. We could say the way you do it is what I call splicing. So even though this bundle here, starting at line 23, this bundle represents my subscription notification payload, I could splice it into the wrapper and say, well, okay, all my entries here are going to become entries in the top level bundle. And so then I say, well, maybe the top level bundle entry 0 is a message header, and entry number 1, the second entry, is a subscription status, and then all subsequent entries are other resources related to that subscription notification. You could do it, but to my mind, it would be simple, similar to putting a document in there.
So the critical difference for me, well, there's two main differences. So first of all, I agree we could specify it that way. And even if we specify it that way, we're still sort of meeting the first recommendation that messaging is just another channel. Now we're talking about the details of how to use it. Somebody could push back and say messaging shouldn't be just another channel. So we'll come back there. But let me make 2 points about what it means to sort of splice the bundles in this way. One, which I find to be distasteful, is that not only do we assign special meaning to being the first entry in the bundle, but now we're assigning a different special meaning to be the second entry in the bundle, and it's this weird sort of position-based logic. You could say, well, we're already in that business because we already said the first entry has a special meaning. But to me, extending that to multiple entries and saying that the position has a meaning is not a great situation.
But you're not. You're just saying focus message header focus points to subscription status, right?
So you could make the logic all about focus and say it's at any bundle entry point you want. That is also true. That's fair. And then the second thought in my mind about why it's a little odd to splice these entries into the top level messaging header to the top level messaging bundle is that we no longer have access to this payload as a consistent nameable object that you can carry along and pass along and forward for other uses. Like maybe if you wanted to have a bridge between messaging and then email, that bridge would have to have a bunch of logic about unsplicing. Whereas here, if we conveyed the messaging notification, the subscription notification as a bundle directly, the logic for handling this becomes very simple.
Yeah, so I guess I would rephrase that and say it's consistent across all the channels if you do it the same way, and that's what this does. So I think that's for me, that's the biggest reason.
Yeah, and frankly, like just totally bluntly, if we agree that messaging is just another channel type, I honestly don't care how it's documented, as long as it's documented clearly. I don't care that much about whether it's really clean or super consistent or easy to understand, because I'm probably not going to do a lot with it in my own implementation work. So the people who are using it are the ones who should decide whether it's better to wrap it or better to splice it or something else that I haven't thought of.
And just to add an additional piece of information for which I think is relevant, almost independently, I don't know how independent it was, but almost independently, IHE arrived at the exact same construct for the reason that entry in a message is restricted to not allow a method regarding the resource that is within the entry, while a history bundle allows that. And IHE needed a way to convey a patient feed where each patient in the bundle had needed to be indicated, whether that was a put, a delete, a post. And so they ended up in a message with a message that contains a subscription, a history bundle with the appropriate things they needed. Not advocating whether that is the best thing, the best proper solution, but independently, this was arrived already at a different in a different venue.
I think that what we did independently bump up against some of those same constraints, and it was probably, I don't remember exactly, but let's say last summer that we sort of started looking at a history bundle, because it was the only type that allowed us to send along optionally a request as well as a response as well as those IDs. Eventually we got to the point where we said, well, it feels hacky to call this a history, and we should just be defining a subscription bundle if we need a different set of constraints. But the fact that we independently arrived at a bundle inside a bundle from this discussion, I didn't realize that. It's very interesting context, and thank you for sharing it. So that was all the recommendations that I wanted to make. There was one more slide in the deck, which is, if you take all these recommendations, you know, if I've convinced everyone sort of well enough that like this is the path forward, I did want to call out one top level concern. And I don't know how to fix this, but I felt sort of obligated to at least call it out, which is sort of the Conways Law concern, which is, you know, roughly within any kind of project, the way that you structure your teams and your organization is going to inform the way that you structure your software architecture. And I think in HL7, we have a risk of this, where the way we structure our work groups means we structure these clusters of resources where each work group sort of has its own sphere of influence and defines a set of solutions within that sphere. And sometimes there's overlap. So when it comes to this issue that we talk about as a subscription topic, you know, sort of what kind of stuff can you listen for? The CDS work group, for CDS purposes, has a similar and overlapping set of definitions. When it comes to the question of how do we send out these notifications, like we've been talking about here, whether it's a subscription status or message header and so on, FHIR infrastructure has been working on the subscription status approach, but of course the INM work group has a different set of resources about message headers and message definitions that you could say overlap. And so for me, this is something that we always ought to keep in mind. And even though FHIR infrastructure is concerned with one specific subset of the resources, I think we've got an obligation to be looking across work groups as well, because we wind up being one of the most connected work groups across work that's happening in FHIR. And this is something that's worth paying attention to. It doesn't change my recommendations, but I think it's worth, again, just highlighting from the perspective of everyone keeping a broad picture about how these designs could work. So that's all the content that I wanted to get through. And I want to now just broadly open up discussion and questions. We've had good discussion throughout, but I just want to make it clear that was everything we really wanted to say.
Right. Thanks for structuring, Josh. The concept of having bundles nested, just two things I thought about that. Maybe it's just very common to have a need for wrapping things multiple times to make it fit whatever channel it needs to be in. So maybe it's just a very natural construct. And the other thing was, if this is a natural construct, should we distinguish the first entry of the bundle, or should the outer bundle be a different resource?
Can you say that last one again?
Well, now we have we make a distinction in different bundles in two ways. One is the bundle type, which is almost a means of having 6 different types of resources in one resource type.
Yep.
And the second we came across here is that we need to bundle bundles, or at least one, and wrap a bundle in another bundle, and then stick an entry 0 to it to tell us what is in the inner bundle, or how it is to be processed.
Yes.
And then I was thinking, should you interchange the entry 0 and the outer bundle?
Yeah. In
so
other words,
should you make explicit there are so you have a subscription notification resource that has all the metadata you need, and within it a bundle with the actual resources that you wanted to convey. The only problem is for messaging.
I understand. Christian, are you saying that rather than having a bundle of, let's just say, of type message, that you're thinking about having a resource like bundle of type message as a top level distinction?
It doesn't even need to be a bundle anymore, because you have one. There's one where you. What we are looking now at a bit is that we have an entry 0 describing what to do with the rest of the resources.
Yep.
Whereas the rest of the resources itself is in essence also then a bundle of resources.
Tapping into this.
Why not promote the entry 0 to the outer resource?
This makes sense also from another reason, because a resource of type bundle in a bundle can mean 2 different things. One is where you actually want to send a resource of type bundle to the other party, just to store a bundle or convey a bundle of some information to a different element. And the other one is because you want to group some kind of behavior. So how do we distinguish between those?
Let's not lose the point that at this point the only, I don't know if I'm coming through, but at this point the only use case that we have found for putting bundle within a bundle is when a bundle is put within a message bundle, where we have a very clearly defined how you find out what it is, and the first entry in a message bundle is message header, and then the message header has a focus, and from there on nothing changes except that that focus is a bundle. And so far that's the only case that we have found for that.
What I wanted to say is the reason we didn't find it earlier is because of this special use of the first entry in a bundle.
So I would like to piggyback on and say, I think that, whether we use a different resource, I think it's kind of far afield from the main question of messaging versus subscription, which I think is the nub of the issue I'm still interested in. It doesn't really address that directly. It does answer a lot of questions, but it doesn't really say when to use which, when, and why.
So I want to try a couple of things in the 13 minutes that we've got left. One is just to try to make this as concrete as possible. I wanted to write these 3 recommendations down on one slide and see what folks think about them. And then the second was, let's, just to be concrete, let's ask folks if there are additional recommendations they would like to see us make, or different recommendations instead of these. Basically, I'm just trying to see how much support or not there is for taking this approach forward. And if somebody wants to come back and say, actually, we might want to blow up the way we do bundles overall, like that's fair game. But I want to first of all, if we can, among folks on the phone now, talk through each of these very briefly. Are there folks who find recommendation number 1, 2, or 3? Sorry, let me back up. Just looking at 1 and 2. So using subscription status to convey notification information for a subscription message, and thinking about messaging as just another channel. For those 2 recommendations, are there folks who would like to push back and say, no, I really wouldn't be able to support that?
You mean that we wouldn't be able to support at least one of them?
No. So I think of recommendation 1 and 2 as going together, as sort of a consistent pair. And then 3 is like a design decision within number 2 about exactly how to convey the messaging notifications over a special messaging channel. 3 is about how a messaging channel works. I feel much less strongly about how it should work, but I wanted to get feedback about whether people agree that we could think about subscription messaging as just another channel for these notifications.
I see. Yeah, I'd push back on that.
Okay, cool. So say more about how we should be looking at this.
How long we got?
11 minutes.
Okay. So this is a much bigger thing, and this is a small part of it. Tell you what, I want to let other people go if they've got thoughts, because I know I could take way too long.
Okay, and what I'll say is after this call is over, I don't expect we'll have any answers. But what I'll do is solicit feedback on Zulip for each of these 3 recommendations, so we can, and feel free to push back against the framing too. But
yes, I need to ask about the recommendations too and how you frame them. Messaging is just another channel for subscription notifications. Are you saying that all messaging in FHIR is another channel for subscription notifications? Or are you just saying notifications should use subscription notifications and not messaging? What does that mean? Messaging is just another channel for subscription.
So hopefully the line below clarifies it, which is subscriptions would define a bunch of channels, REST hooks, WebSockets, email, messaging, and that's an open set, so it's extensible. People can define their own channels. They would all share a common payload format, which is based on recommendation number 1, but they might provide different kinds of wrappers. Like in REST hooks, we might not have any wrapper at all. We just send the payload directly. In messaging, there would be a messaging bundle wrapper. In email, there would be, I don't know the email protocols well enough, but whatever you call the whole package that an email is sent in.
Yeah.
That's what this is intended to state.
So it's not saying
just to clarify, this feedback is specifically for how to represent a notification within subscriptions. It is not trying to answer anything about when do you use subscription, when do you use notification, when do you use messaging, and any of that is not part of these recommendations. This is just, are we okay if the subscription specifications follows these 3 recommendations? Is that correct, Josh?
That is correct. And there may be additional recommendations we want to make about helping people consider when this is the right tool. But that's outside the scope of this slide.
Yeah, so I think this still rephrase my question, make it clearer. That's what I was asking. So great.
So just to jump in with what I thought was discussed a little earlier, one of the options not listed here is saying the subscription status or notification object should essentially have a base type of bundle itself so that it would just contain the entries and that's it. Is that, whoever was discussing that earlier, is that kind of the idea behind that one?
I need an example to understand what you just said. So maybe after
I went ahead and posted one in that same repo. I didn't put a link to it yet.
That's okay. I think I'm in the right spot then. And I'll pull it up here. 3 minutes ago.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a resource type of, let's say, notification that sort of acts bundle-like in that it conveys a list of entries, but is not exactly a bundle because it has these additional top-level properties that bundle does not have.
Correct. And that's, I thought, what was being proposed, someone in discussion earlier.
I think this is a good idea. Actually, we should also consider doing the same thing for message header.
So the one note that I have on this, and I don't really know what it means, but today in FHIR, the only place that resources ever get embedded inside of other resources, other than contained, okay, is bundle.entry.resource. So this would be basically violating that current constraint and saying, well, actually, there's a bunch of places where we might want to directly embed one resource inside of another rather than just including a link. And maybe this is just the first of many.
You wouldn't want to know how many discussions I have of people wanted to use contained for that.
Yeah, I bet.
I believe it.
So this strikes me as actually in some ways a much bigger change than anything else we've been talking about. Just the core how FHIR models the world.
To respond to Gino, this is close to what I meant. Although I thought we would then wrap the entry array into a bundle and stick that into the notification resource. So
why
keep the
would you do
concept of a
that?
bundle as something to combine other resources in, and then stick it in.
Can you say something about what problem you're solving with this approach?
The concept of that the actual thing you want to convey is a list of resources, and then you need to wrap it one or multiple times. First, you need to wrap it with the subscription information, so turning it into a subscription notification. Then you need to wrap it again in a message, adding message header information. And then since message is not telling anything about the way it is actually being sent, probably another wrapper has to go along for the actual channel that's being used. But that is not. But maybe that is not FHIR anymore.
It sounds like protocol layers.
But it is a lot bigger than this, so I don't think we should pursue this a lot in this discussion. It's just something that came up when I heard the discussion around nesting bundles.
I think you make a valid, Christian. I think you make a valid point. If the entry element in the subscription notification is very close to the stuff we want to do in bundle, you might be right. If there is deviation from that, we might want to do something special. Maybe you could even think making entry a data type.
But again, this would indeed be a lot bigger change than to discuss here.
Yeah, but let's park that for now and make a list of actually what kind of information needs to go in the subscription. Take the examples from this perspective and then make a choice. But I do like the approach where you say, I have now a message or an event or whatever that's linked to the channel, the protocol subscription.
So I think, Bas, if I understood that right, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, I'm just trying to test whether I did. I think what you just said is that you like recommendation number 2.
Yes.
Okay.
I like recommendation so much, including the other one, that I think we should consider doing similar things to the message header as we did to notification. Because then we don't have the issue anymore of bundles in a bundle. That's a topic for a different call.
Okay, so in terms of next steps, what I'm going to propose is to try to take this discussion forward on the infrastructure work group chat around these 3 recommendations. And I'll start off by creating 3 message threads about each one and let people weigh in with thumbs up and thumbs down and comments. And of course, people should feel free to blow up the whole thing and suggest other stuff. Process-wise, how does that sound? And do other people have good ideas about how else we could take this forward?
I guess is one other philosophical way to look at this is like, looking at that notification thing and having it have a source property that says this is the source from which this notification came. One of which being subscription, and one of which being, some other triggering mechanism. That's kind of the opposite of number 2 is really what we're talking about. It's really like, the opposite of number 2, the inverse. Just throwing it out.
There might be an idea in that, but I would probably need an example to fully understand it.
But I mean, I think the notification example that we were looking at is exactly what I was thinking, except that it has subscription-specific things in it, and just factoring out those subscription-specific things so that a notification could have been sent either because it was the result of a subscription, or because it was a result of a pre-coordinated configuration, or because it, like, for for whatever reason it was sent. Subscriptions being only one of the reasons.
So maybe the way to continue with this is to, I don't know, to have a discussion about notifications and whether there is a benefit to extend a general notion of notification that is used for subscription, but also for unsolicited notifications. That's one way to continue this discussion.
Yeah, one thing that
if I have an unsolicited notification, how does the system know it needs to send a message?
The only answer to that is it's out of band. It knows somehow. And one thing that I think we might propose on this front it is a notion of these unsolicited notifications as being sort of implicit subscriptions. Maybe we could do a write-up about how that might work, but I don't think it impacts the recommendations on this slide. Whether we chose to do subscription notifications this way or not seems independent from whether we choose to provide some unsolicited notification mechanisms inside of this framework. Those to me seem like dissociable questions.
I agree completely.
So I really am gonna keep trying to drive towards how do we do this part of the use case, even if we do propose something about unsolicited notifications. All right, we're at time. Obviously, we've still got way more to discuss. We might schedule another ad hoc call, but in the meantime, we'll try to take the discussion forward on Zulip. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. It's been a robust and good discussion.
Cool. Have a good
Thank you
afternoon.
for preparing, Josh.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, all.
Cheers.
Bye.